Hey everyone, and welcome! Today we are totally decoding the worldview of Kid Rock, drawing directly from a remarkably candid recent interview he did with Sky News Australia. Look, whether you absolutely love the guy, can't stand him, or are honestly just downright confused by him, understanding the architecture of his beliefs actually gives us a fascinating lens into modern American culture. We're going to look right past the fireworks and the crazy headlines to examine what really drives him.
Okay, let's dive into this. We've got a structured roadmap today to unpack this wild duality. First, we'll be defining the American dream. Then, we'll hit cultural and political flashpoints. Third, a presidential friendship. Next up is his musical and spiritual evolution. And finally, number 5, Kid Rock versus Bob Ritchie.
All right, Section 1, Defining the American Dream. This is where his entire political and social worldview is anchored. When he was asked point blank what America means to him, his answer was immediate. He just repeated, freedom, 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 freedom. You know, that simple driving repetition is absolutely crucial because it establishes the total baseline for all of his subsequent cultural arguments. In his view, the freedom to speak your mind, and yeah, even the freedom to be completely reckless, is the very core of the country's identity.
And this brilliantly illustrates how he defines the American dream. For him, it is definitely not just about comfort. He draws a really hard line between living a modest life and achieving ultimate success. He notes that, sure, working 40 or 50 hours a week might get you a nice car or, a little cabin on a lake, and he totally acknowledges that's a perfectly valid version of the dream for some people. But for him, true success requires intense sacrifice and the fortitude to literally conquer the top of the food chain.
To put that into perspective, look at this timeline. If you want to climb to the absolute top, it's not a standard 40-hour-a-week gig. He argues it requires over 10,000 hours of sacrifice, often spanning more than a decade. It's like a giant puzzle that demands brutal honesty about what you're actually good at, combined with relentless, disciplined work. And honestly, this strict work ethic is the primary lens through which he judges pretty much everything else in society.
Let's move on and see how this builds into Section 2, Cultural and Political Flashpoints.
He's very upfront about his views on modern controversies, explicitly stating he feels the country is catering to extreme mentalities. He points to 3 specific grievances. First, he calls the focus on trans activists like Dylan Mulvaney and the debates around sports and bathrooms quote-unquote bananas. Second, he is fiercely opposed to unvetted open borders. And third, he expresses deep frustration over what he saw as strict overreaching COVID-19 mandates.
But there's a really specific nuance to his stance on borders that is central to understanding his politics. On one hand, he actually has a deep respect for hardworking immigrants who assimilate and take on the undesirable jobs, picking vegetables, cleaning hotel rooms, basically busting their backs to work their way up toward that American dream we were just talking about. For those folks, he says, come on in, man, let's party. But he contrasts this directly with his intense frustration over unvetted border crossings, which he sees as totally different.
We see a very similar anecdotal contrast when he talks about COVID lockdowns. He affectionately describes his experience in Nashville, where honky-tonks were open and life felt, relatively normal. He puts that right up against his home state of Michigan, criticizing the governor there for strict bans that literally prevented people from buying seeds to plant their own backyard gardens. To him, that kind of government restriction was just completely absurd.
Okay, moving on to Section 3, a presidential friendship. Here's where his traditionalist values align with a very famous relationship. He actually describes hanging out with the former president as having a front-row seat to the greatest shit show on earth, which, let's be honest, is a pretty colorful way to put it. But it perfectly encapsulates how he views his proximity to Trump. He sees it as highly entertaining, a little chaotic for sure, but also something he deeply enjoys and finds incredibly meaningful.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that number right there, 5. That's the exact number of hours both of these guys sleep each night. Because they share this incredibly short sleep schedule, it leads to these late-night or weekend phone calls where they just check in to chat. He laughingly points out that Trump isn't calling him for geopolitical advice on Iran, right? He's just calling to connect on a personal, everyday level.
When it comes to all the political noise surrounding the former president, Kid Rock dismisses it entirely. He firmly asserts that Trump is a genuine leader. When critics bring up Trump's wealth, he totally brushes it off, pointing out that he's just a smart businessman who made his money long before taking office. At the end of the day, he truly believes Trump's heart and soul are focused purely on putting the country first.
Right, on to Section 4, Musical and Spiritual Evolution.
Let's look at how the provocateur is shifting creatively.
Talk about a massive shift. He totally acknowledges coming a long, long way from his early, highly explicit rock and roll days, the devil without a cause era. Today, he's actively working on what he calls a stadium spiritual album. Now, it's not your traditional Christian or gospel record, but rather a massive, stadium-filling album packed with positive messages. He says it's the kind of music he would actually want to hear at church.
To really see the dedicated craftsman beneath that wild persona, just look at the disciplined way he wrote his hit song Born Free with legendary producer Rick Rubin. It started with a simple guitar riff, but then Rubin implemented a strict rule. They wouldn't record a single track until they mutually agreed on every single lyric. Actually, scratch that. It went even further. Rubin forced him to strip away all of his usual self-deprecating humor and corny jokes, demanding total, unironic sincerity.
And this newfound sincerity ties into a deeply personal admission he made during the interview. While he points out he has always been a God-fearing man, he revealed that in recent years, God has been speaking to him, and he is finally, truly deciding to listen. It highlights a very real, ongoing evolution from a rebellious rocker to a much more spiritually attuned artist.
Which brings us to our grand finale, Section 5, Kid Rock versus Bob Ritchie. So the crucial point is that this right here is where the ultimate duality lies. On one side, you have the Kid Rock persona, the guy who intentionally stirs the pot online, fires back at critics twice as hard, and shoots off fireworks in his backyard. But on the exact opposite side, you have Bob Ritchie, the man who is secretly hyper-disciplined, wakes up at 2 a.m., grinds for 5 straight hours, exercises, and is deeply dedicated to his studio engineering. The reckless public image actively funds and essentially protects his quiet, disciplined private life.
Nowhere is that Bob Ritchie persona more obvious than when he talks about being a grandpa. When they asked him about his role with his grandkids, he delivered this absolute gem of a quote, "Have them to the house, get them all hopped up on Mountain Dew and Swedish Fish, and send them home." I mean, it's hilarious, but it perfectly illustrates how much he genuinely cherishes his wholesome, everyday role as a family man, far away from all the flashing cameras. Which brings us to a massive milestone, America's upcoming 250th birthday. This wild duality perfectly framed his thoughts when he was asked to write a hypothetical birthday card to the country.
True to form, you basically get 2 completely separate messages. The Kid Rock message was exactly what you'd expect. A wild, celebratory shout-out. Congratulations, this place is awesome. But the Bob Ritchie message? Entirely different. It was a solemn, thoughtful reflection. He offered deep gratitude to the country for surviving hard truths and for providing the foundational freedom and opportunity for success, respectfully signing off with "One nation under God."
So, that leaves us with this final, really provocative question. How do loud public personas obscure our understanding of modern American values? We are so quick to judge the fireworks, right? But in doing so, we often miss the 2 a.m. discipline entirely. Next time you see a flashy headline, ask yourself who you're really looking at. Thanks so much for exploring this explainer with me today, and I'll see you next time.